Good morning, and thank you for tuning in to Heroes and Patriots, a program about national security, intelligence, and foreign policy. Today is Thursday, September 29, 2022, and we are streaming live from the studios of KMUD Community Radio in Northern California. I'm Mary Massey with my terrific co-host, John SAKOWICZ. Good morning, John.
Good morning, Mary. Good morning to our audience listening live to the broadcast and listening to the web stream throughout California and throughout the country. Thank you for listening, and thank you for supporting KMUD.
And John is my co-host, and we spent an eventful day yesterday. He was in the hospital, and he got out of his hospital bed to be with Chip Gibbons and me today. Right, John?
I was in cardiac surgery for 3 hours yesterday. That's how much this show and all of you mean to me. I had cardiac ablation surgery. I was intubated for 3 hours. But the show we're going to do today is extremely important because it's about how the CIA is spying on Julian Assange, but also on its own citizens, on American citizens who are progressive journalists who are part of Julian Assange's legal team. This is an affront to our constitutional rights. It's an affront to all of us, and the show means a lot to me. And our guest, Chip Gibbons, is someone we've had on the show. This is, I think, the third time. Remarkable investigative journalist in his own right.
So today's show and all programs will be archived here at kmud.org, our program website, heroespatriots.org, and as well, we are on Facebook. Dorothy, are you having trouble there reaching him?
Yeah, so far it's not answering. It's just his. But do we have him on Skype?
No.
Okay.
So let me continue. That is the correct number that you've got. We invite you as listeners to call in with questions for our guests, 707-923-3911. And we do ask that you please be brief and to the point so that we can get in as many calls as possible. Dorothy is our program engineer, and we'd like to thank her and all folks at KMUD for helping us out with today's program. And I will say, views and opinions expressed during this program do not necessarily reflect those of the board, staff, volunteers, members, or the underwriters of our KMUD Community Radio. As John mentioned, we'll be talking about the CIA in connection with UC Global spying on Julian Assange, his legal team, other journalists, and activists. So we are ready to start as soon as we get our guest on the line. And I will say briefly that Mr. Gibbons is policy director for Defending Rights in Dissent. He has a new piece in Jacobin examining the allegations that the company UC Global was co-opted by the CIA, resulting in violations of civil liberties, human rights, and international law. Gibbons writes, the allegations against UC Global and the CIA constitute a major spying scandal with an international scope. The story involves breaches of an embassy's sovereignty and the surveillance of a range of journalists, human rights defenders, and politicians. Whether they were intentional targets or collateral damage in the CIA's war on WikiLeaks, their surveillance, like that of Mr. Assange, remains an outrageous deprivation of human rights. And we quote, end quote. So we now have Chip Gibbons on the line. Chip, welcome back to the program.
Thank you for having me. I really appreciate you having me on so many times to talk about Julian Assange, Daniel Hale, and all of these very important issues about the future of press freedom that unfortunately a lot of people are not as willing to cover as you are. So I really appreciate you providing a platform for a discussion of these vital issues.
Let's look back. Sure. Let's look back a second and remind our listeners how Julian Assange got in the crosshairs of the CIA and for how long?
Sure. So Julian Assange founded a publishing website called WikiLeaks, which was sort of novel in that it provided a secure platform for whistleblowers to transfer documents directly to. In 2010, 2011, a whistleblower named Chelsea Manning transferred to WikiLeaks documents from the Iraq War logs, the Afghan War logs, State Department cables, as well as detainee assessments of people detained at Guantanamo Bay, the notorious prison camp we have in Cuba. WikiLeaks worked with mainstream news outlets like the New York Times and The Guardian to publish this information. This obviously greatly upset the Pentagon, the NSA, the CIA, the National Security Establishment in general, who, really hate whistleblowers and really hate having their stories exposed, and also sort of recognize that with the Internet, the capacity for a greater volume of transfer of information was capable. Right? Remember, Daniel Ellsberg had to photocopy the Pentagon papers page by page with help from his children. It took him weeks or months to do that, whereas Chelsea Manning just burned information to a Lady Gaga CD. It didn't take months of photocopying. And, of course, a website has global reach. After that, they went extremely hard against Chelsea Manning, detaining her in conditions that were most likely torture, put her in this sort of phony court-martial, where even though she pled guilty to charges carrying decades in prison, they still went forward with a court-martial, which is a military type of trial, in order to try to convict her under the Espionage Act and for aiding the enemy. Aiding the enemy potentially carried a death sentence, but they merely sought a life sentence. And Manning was, of course, acquitted of aiding the enemy, which was a farcical charge, but was convicted under the Espionage Act, which doesn't have the same intent requirement. Around that time, they convene a secret grand jury in Virginia to discuss indicting Assange. Julian Assange, the Obama administration discusses getting other countries to file criminal charges against Julian Assange. Around this point, he faces 2 allegations of sexual misconduct in Sweden, which are serious allegations that deserve a serious investigation. He delays his departure from Sweden in order to answer police questions. Once he is then in the United Kingdom, the Swedish government, which has never charged him and never charges him, again asked to question him. This creates a bit of a standoff where Assange says he will return to Sweden for questions if they guarantee not to extradite him to the United States, which a United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture has called a reasonable request under international law, and that the fact that the Swedish government refused to grant it is indicative of their actual intent. And we now know the Australian government considered the possibility that Sweden was acting as a conduit for the U.S. here very, very seriously, which is not to downplay the seriousness of the allegations he faced. It's worth noting when Assange was in British custody, the Swedish extradition request was quashed on the grounds that they could easily interview him in Belmarsh. This would have been their 3rd interview, at which point the Swedish government finally drops completely the preliminary investigation on the grounds that no further interview is necessary, and it would never sustain the case, which is a remarkable admission given that they essentially, with this extradition order, forced him to take refuge in the Ecuadorian embassy. In 2017, he releases something called Vault 7, which is the CIA's secret hacking tools. And at this point, the CIA becomes extremely angry. They're very sort of arrogant in that they're probably the only government agency that has not been hit by WikiLeaks disclosure. At this point, though, they have been, and they're particularly embarrassed because they're heavily monitoring Assange, or heavily monitoring WikiLeaks, and they had no idea this was coming. They had no idea one of their own employees had copied this information and that WikiLeaks had it and was going to release it. And Michael Pompeo is the head of the CIA at this time, and he is very angry. He gives a very disturbing and dark speech where he attacks whistleblowers broadly, describing them as like narcissists who think they're aiding human freedom but really aren't, and then describes WikiLeaks as a unique threat in the long-running CIA war on whistleblowers because now with the Internet, people no longer need a publisher, and then declares WikiLeaks non-state hostile intelligence agency, which at the time a lot of people thought was just bluster, but that term carries legal significance in that the CIA was able to engage in covert operations against WikiLeaks without notifying the president or Congress or any of the other legal proceedings, because they don't need to issue what's called a finding if they're engaged in offensive counterintelligence against another intelligence agency. This has only ever been applied to state actors. They try to argue or find evidence that WikiLeaks is a Russian agent, and they fail to do so. So they come up with this sort of invented legal category that would authorize them to engage in these sorts of lawless acts against WikiLeaks. And it's worth pointing out the NSA also considered a very similar thing about a decade before. So now the CIA is engaged in this offensive counterintelligence, and this brings us to the UC Global aspect of the story, which is really a bizarre and strange part of the story. But for 3 years now, a Spanish judge, they have investigating judges in Spain, it's a very different legal system than ours, has been investigating the owner of the company UC Global for violating Assange's privacy rights, violating Assange's attorney-client privilege, as well as corruption and bribery. And UC Global was hired by the Ecuadorian intelligence services to provide security at the embassy, right? The Ecuadorian embassy in London, where Assange sought refuge, didn't have a very sophisticated security operation, but now you have the British police, threatening to storm it and doing this constant round-the-clock siege of the embassy. So if Assange ever steps outside of it, they can apprehend him, and they obviously now have a very high-profile and unexpected visitor. So they hire this security firm. And in 2017, a lot of their security protocols change. They start making Assange's visitors leave their electronic devices with him. They take passports, and they install new cameras. And what we know from the Spanish investigation, that 2 whistleblowers from the company have come forward and said that around this time that the owner of the company, David Morales, starts traveling to the U.S. for these security conferences and and tells the employees, we are now working for the dark side, and gives orders on behalf of people he refers to as our American friends. And these include orders for increased surveillance within the embassy. They set up security cameras with both audio and visual capacity, wanting to access. They want the Americans to have real-time access to these cameras so they can spy on Assange and his legal team as it's happening in real time. They ask for the employees to steal a diaper from one of Assange's children in order to prove the paternity of the child. They also at one point say near the end the American friends are getting very desperate to get him out of the embassy. And one of the things that they mention is just leaving the front door open. So random people can come in off the street and kidnap him or poison him. And, I mean, these are the claims that are made by 2 former employees. And people are probably asking, well, what do you have to validate that? And that's a very good question. The U.S. has not cooperated with the Spanish investigation in spite of a mutual legal assistance treaty saying it will not do so unless the judge provides the information, the identities of the sources, i.e. unmask the whistleblowers who were similarly granted protected status in a UK court proceeding because, they're testifying against the CIA. You probably won't last very long if your name is known. But what we do know is that about a year and a half after these allegations are made in the Spanish court, 30-some former intelligence employees come forward to Yahoo News and tell stories about Mike Pompeo's war on WikiLeaks, which includes accessing the security cameras in real time, a plot to kidnap Assange, as well as a discussion of killing him that reportedly didn't go very far, but this still mirrors exactly what the UC Global employees have said. So it's pretty powerful corroboration. It's enough that people should at least be very disturbed.
Yeah, I want you to say that again, because it's so important. Not only does the CIA and its contractors does most of its work. CIA does most of its work. 70% of its work it outsources to contractors, so it has plausible deniability. Not only were they spying on Assange, but they could have kidnapped or killed him. That's breathtaking.
It's really troubling, especially since, in the 1970s, I was around then, but, we as a country came to an agreement that the CIA should not be in the assassination business. And this was directed at, world leaders, some of which were quite unsavory, some of which were not unsavory and being targeted by the CIA, right? But we all agreed as a society that assassination was something the CIA shouldn't be engaged in. And here they are discussing. Now, it's worth mentioning they reported didn't go very far, but they are discussing assassinating a journalist who has exposed U.S. war crimes. The kidnapping plot actually was, per the intelligence officials who spoke to Yahoo, very, very serious, enough that a National Security Council lawyer was incredibly concerned because at this time, Assange faced no charges in the U.S. He does now, and the discussion was, where are they going to put him, in a black site? I mean, what are they going to do with him? And it is worth, once again, going back to UC Global, per the Yahoo news article, the kidnapping plot comes into fruition after they learn that Assange's lawyers are talking with the Ecuadorian embassy about having him assigned diplomatic status so he can travel on a diplomatic passport to a third-party country. Obviously, this has to be a country that doesn't have good relations with the U.S. The legal team was willing to consider countries like Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, which, whatever you think of their governments, if you are fleeing from the CIA, they're probably a lot safer than London for you. In the same way that if I was, fleeing from Russia, I would not go to Belarus.
Right.
And that they had knowledge of this effort. The Ecuadorian government ultimately offers him a diplomatic assignment to Russia, which he refuses because he doesn't want to legitimate the claims that he is a Russian agent. So he could have, in theory, gone to Russia and escaped the embassy and turns that down on principle, which is something to think about when we hear all these smears about Assange. But UC Global filmed that conversation. We know that they did that, and we know that they wrote up reports about it. And so we know that they played a pivotal role in escalating the CIA's campaign against Assange. That if not for their actions here, it's likely they would not have developed the kidnapping plot. And in the Yahoo story, it goes well beyond just kidnapping. They become concerned in general that the Russians are going to try to come get Assange, and their concern is not that he is leaving the country or the UK with all these documents, right? He already has them. It's over the propaganda victory the Russians would get in giving asylum to both Snowden and Assange, people who are, people in Western Europe and Latin America and other countries view as people who have sort of poked a stick in the eye of an empire and exposing their dirty laundry and are now being persecuted, right? They were way more concerned with the propaganda victory that Russia would get, which is worth thinking about because, if you don't want Russia to get that propaganda victory, then stop persecuting whistleblowers and journalists. It's a very self-inflicted wound for the U.S. But, they discuss things like, what if the Russians come in a diplomatic vehicle and take him out the embassy, and they have plans to engage in a shootout with Russians on the street? Or if he gets somehow in a plane on the tarmac, they were going to have snipers shoot the wheels out of the plane. So now you have the CIA plotting with the British as accomplices, engaging in a shootout with a Russian diplomatic vehicle on the streets of London, right? That's an act of war. And that's also, London's a very crowded metropolitan area. You're not going to get into a shootout with an embassy vehicle and, not probably kill a few civilians or just people wandering around London as well.
Right.
Not that was of any concern.
So, Chip, all this begs the question of where's the oversight? Now, not just because of my own resume, but also for personal reasons as well. This show has got good relations with members of Congress who have served on both the Senate and House Intelligence Committees. In fact, both my sons were got their congressional nominations for federal military academies. One from Senator Dianne Feinstein, who chaired the Senate Intelligence Committee, and Austin got his nomination from Mike Thompson, who was a Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee and chaired one of the subcommittees for human intelligence and I think counterintelligence. So our relationships were good. We know these members of Congress. We know them to be progressive, responsible people. So where's the congressional oversight? Where's the congressional oversight? How can the CIA contract out most of their work, and even to the extent where assassinations are possible, torture is possible, drone strikes are possible, kidnapping is possible, imprisonment in black sites is possible? Where's the congressional oversight?
I ask myself that question all the time. As someone who also has good relations with congressional offices and does advocacy on the Hill, it is a very important question. I mean, the legacy of the Senate and House Intelligence Committees is that they come out of the Church and Pike Committee, these landmark investigations into abuses of the intelligence agencies, and are supposed to exist to prevent those abuses from happening. Unfortunately, we know 40-some years later, those committees don't really have an adversarial relationship with the intelligence communities. They're more about enabling them than they are overseeing them. We know with the non-state hostile intelligence thing, that was a way to get around oversight. But that same year, the Senate Intelligence Committee put something in I believe it's the National Intelligence Authorization Act, labeling WikiLeaks a non-state intelligence actor, something that Ryan Grim of The Intercept has reported on, which Ron Wyden at the time called attention to and concern, which really raises questions that the Senate Intelligence Committee could have been in on the plot, right, which would be extremely disturbing. You know, Julian Assange is a very controversial figure, whether you think he's a hero or a bad man. None of that really matters when it comes down to indicting a journalist or a person for journalist-like activities under the Espionage Act or, CIA assassination plots. But I will say this, as someone who lives in D.C. and advocates on the Hill for civil liberties issues, I mean, he has been made extremely toxic and extremely demonized. I think you'd have more luck in Congress, lobbying or advocating on behalf of the rights of Osama bin Laden than you would on Julian Assange.
Wow.
He's just so despised.
Yeah.
Well, we know that the abuses run the full spectrum. I mean,
Yeah.
I don't think anyone here is a big fan of Donald Trump, but yet the Espionage Act was used for the FBI's raid, to justify the FBI's raid on Trump's Mar-a-Lago residence. So whether you're talking about someone like Julian Assange or whether you're talking about someone like Donald Trump, the abuses of the Espionage Act are far-ranging. Isn't that true?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I mean, unfortunately, indicting whistleblowers under the Espionage Act is a bipartisan affair. The Bush administration sort of dusted it off to investigate people, with the exception of some AIPAC lobbyists, which is an extraordinarily strange case. They didn't actually indict anyone. The Obama administration revived many of those cases and brought Espionage Act indictments against people like Thomas Drake, Jeffrey Sterling, John Kiriakou, who were all investigated during the Bush administration and had nothing happen to. And then they, of course, then used the act against Edward Snowden, Chelsea Manning, and others. But they wouldn't use it against Assange because they thought due to what's called the New York Times problem. The idea that whatever you think of WikiLeaks, that the activity you are indicting them for is legally non-distinguishable between what the New York Times does. Any precedent justifying this type of prosecution would open the door to prosecuting the New York Times. Donald Trump comes in, and Jeff Sessions and Mike Pompeo and Bill Barr, and they have no concerns about this, and they bring the indictment against Assange. Also, a 6 or 7 year old case against a drone whistleblower named Daniel Hale, who's a very courageous person who's currently sitting in federal prison for working with The Intercept to expose civilian casualties in the drone program. So unfortunately, both parties have shown that they're okay with the use of the Espionage Act against whistleblowers. And, the Trump Mar-a-Lago thing, that is such a bizarre moment. He's not a whistleblower, he's not a journalist, but the provision of the Espionage Act they're using against him, 790, that is the same one they have indictments against Assange under. That's the same one they brought indictments against Thomas Drake under. That is the provision that they usually use to go after whistleblowers and journalists, and it is very troubling. And, they have 2 other charges. They also investigated him under warrant, one of which carries a much stiffer sentence than the Espionage Act does, so it's entirely unnecessary. You don't need the Espionage Act to go after Donald Trump, and I would argue that it's the worst possible way to go after him, because these Espionage Act trials have this sort of pageantry of secrecy, right? A lot of information is withheld from the jury, withheld from the judge. There was one case in the early Obama administration where the judge admitted they had no idea what the defendant who he was sentencing had leaked or who he had leaked it to, but the government told him it was very serious. So I think any sort of prosecution of someone like Trump needs to be very transparent and needs to be something where, both the people who want him put away and those who think he's a, victim of the deep state, which is a ludicrous assertion. As someone, he did plenty of escalation of deep state activities against Assange, against Iran, against Venezuela. Right. But for both parties here, you really do need a transparent process, and you just don't get that under the Espionage Act.
Mm-hmm. We're speaking with Chip Gibbons. He is the policy director for Defending Rights and Dissent. And Chip, we have a caller on the phone with a question. Caller, if you're listening, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Mary. My name is Pat Rosenfield, and I really want to thank you, Mr. Gibbons, for the important work you're doing. And I wanted to come back to the demonization of Julian Assange. I'm wondering what the implications of that is going to be for other whistleblowers. We've seen, not that many recently. And then the broader question of the effect on civil liberties for ordinary citizens that might possibly be doing something, writing something controversial, but not at the level of circulating documents or something, but even might get into that in a modest way, or just might be prevented, might self-censor themselves. I'm just wondering what the implications are for both the whistleblowers who are in positions to reveal important documents and policies that should be known, and then ordinary citizens.
All right. Thank you, caller. Chip?
Thank you. Demonization is the go-to tactic here besides prosecution. Nearly every whistleblower who has ever come forward, the U.S. government has attempted to demonize them. Part of the reasons that Richard Nixon ended up getting thrown out of office was that when Daniel Ellsberg came forward with the Pentagon Papers, he had the White House plumbers unit who were not involved in plumbing, break into his psychiatrist's office in order to find derogatory information. Does this prosecution have a chilling effect on other whistleblowers? I think it does, and I think all of this sort of normalization of the use of the Espionage Act at this time does as well. John Kiriakou, a CIA whistleblower, always talks about the penalty that somebody got when he was working at the CIA for giving information to a reporter they were having a relation with, and it was very, very mild. The Pike Committee was the congressional companion to the Senate Church Committee, which found a lot of dirt from the CIA. the White House refused to allow it to be released. They classify it. Somebody leaked the entire Pike Committee report to the Village Voice, and that person was, and I think NBC News as well, and that person was never found or indicted. But, you know, today, fast forward many decades later, you have the Senate torture report, which similarly found a lot of dirt on the CIA, and the White House refuses to allow to be released. No one has ever leaked the Senate torture report, and I do think the incredibly more hostile prosecutorial environment to whistleblowers could have played a role there, right? We've heard stories about when John Kiriaki was contacting them. So I do think this normalization of hunting and prosecuting under the Espionage Act journalist sources is having the impact that it's intended to have, which is to prevent people from coming forward, right? That was the Obama administration's stated policy, was they wanted to deter leaks or whistleblowers. That's what multiple CIA directors of both parties have said the justification for going against Assange is to deter people from ever doing this again. And I do worry it is having somewhat of an impact. How much, I can't say. I mean, there's always going to be someone like Daniel Ellsberg who fully understands the consequences of their actions and says, you know, I have to do this. I'm compelled to do this. 175 years in prison is worth it to tell the people the truth about the Vietnam War. But, I mean, this is going to have a chilling effect, and I think we've already seen it.
Right. And so it begs the question of who do we not have something to protect people that come forward and expose military, government, not the usual thing, but things that are clandestine on the dark side, you know, the Chelsea Mannings and so forth. What is your thought on that? And I also wonder if you could update us on the status of Assange. I know he's in a prison in Britain, and even the judicial system there was afraid to extradite him to the U.S. because they were worried he would be thrown in a black hole.
Yeah, I mean, there are official channels for whistleblowers. Most whistleblower advocates say they're not very effective or impactful. It's worth noting that both Thomas Drake and Jeffrey Sterling both went through official channels, and basically what happened to them is they got indicted later on. Jeffrey Sterling was a CIA whistleblower who gave information to the Senate Intelligence Committee, who maintains he was not a source for a New York Times reporter, but later when a New York Times reporter reported on some of that information, he was indicted and convicted. It's clear that they wanted someone after the 2005 NSA revelations to be prosecuted. They settled on Thomas Drake, who had nothing to do with those revelations, in part because his name was given over to the FBI and others as an internal whistleblower. But when it comes to like a Chelsea Manning or a Daniel Ellsberg or an Edward Snowden, right, there really are no channels because what they are blowing the whistle on is policy itself, right? Mm-hmm. It is U.S. the metadata of every U.S. citizen. The NSA General Counsel has signed off on it. You know, Thomas Drake always mentions he was opposing a program that the President of the United States himself had personally authorized. You know, if the President authorizes it, if select members of Congress are in on it, if the phony FISA court is in on it, right? Who do you blow the whistle to, right? You're blowing the whistle on the system itself. Or if Chelsea Manning, I mean, I used to organize speaking events when I was in high school for members of Iraq Veterans Against the War. I mean, they would talk about the horrible brutality they witnessed that is the nature of any sort of protracted occupation of a people who don't wish to be occupied by a foreign power. I mean, that is the realities of war. That's the realities of occupation. So who then do you blow the whistle on about the routine violence of the Iraq War? I mean, the military inspector general is going to go, okay, you know, this is the policy. So there's sort of two issues here. One is that the channels for whistleblowers are not very good, and in the intelligence community, it oftentimes sets them up to be retaliated against later, and that many of these policies, the system is not designed to process complaints about. It's designed to facilitate them.
I want you to talk about the role of some of the secret CIA assets that are behind contractors like UC Global. And I'm thinking about Sheldon, the late Sheldon Adelson, the former multi-billionaire casino mogul, rabidly, fanatically pro-Israel, but also is contracts with has contracted with UC Global as well. Had his own agenda against Iran with UC Global. Has funded UC Global. Perhaps acted as a liaison between the CIA and UC Global and going after Assange. Talk to us a little bit about some of these very shadowy figures, very dark people.
Yeah, Adelson is a very strange part of the story. I mean, it's an important part of the story, and it is plausible that he was the go-between, or someone in his security detail was the go-between between the CIA, although there isn't exactly a smoking gun there, but there is enough unusual behavior that it's worth mentioning. Adelson is, as you mentioned, a very fanatical right-wing, pro-Israel, anti-Palestinian, or was. He's deceased now. He was opposed to AIPAC because AIPAC supported nominally a two-state solution, and he wasn't opposed to a two-state solution because he wanted a binational state with equal rights for everyone, like some on the left does. He was opposed because he wanted the Palestinians to be subjected to permanent apartheid and occupation. He's also an incredibly influential figure in the Republican Party, or was. Once again, he's deceased now. He was considered a kingmaker. When Chris Christie refers to the West Bank or Gaza as occupied territory, he has to personally apologize to Sheldon Adelson. That is how powerful this person is. He was the biggest donor or fundraiser for Donald Trump. The head of UC Global, David Morales, begins this strange relationship with Adelson. He travels to Las Vegas frequently. He stays in his hotel. Many of the instructions from the American Friends come from Morales when he is staying in Adelson's hotel. And he gets this security contract from Adelson to personally provide security for Adelson's yacht when it is in the Mediterranean. And then that might not sound like that big of a deal, but both of the whistleblowers within UC Global have honed in on this. And the one in their testimony to the British court during the extradition really stresses how unusual and just sort of nonsensical this is. The yacht is only in the Mediterranean for a short period of time, and it has its own security team on board that is far more sophisticated than anything Mr. Morales can do. And it wasn't like they entered the Mediterranean, the whole security team, got off the yacht and then, came back on when they got out. So it's really a contract that makes no sense.
Right.
It's completely illogical, but it was extremely lucrative, right? So he's paying the UC Global owner a large amount of money for a security contract that is completely, entirely illogical. And, when he goes out and visits him, he comes back with further instructions from the American Friends. This has led for journalists and investigators in Spain to speculate that he is plays some sort of role as a conduit between the CIA and UC Global, and it's entirely plausible, right? I mean, it is at this point mostly speculation, but it's not unfounded speculation. It's very difficult to look at the facts that we know and not get a real sort of feeling that something fishy is here.
Yeah, if I were a screenplay writer, I would write a very dark, movie script on Sheldon Adelson. My experience with him goes all the way back to Macau, back when I was stationed in Macau, where Sheldon Adelson was using his casinos to spy on Chinese government officials who were illegally gambling in Macau, and then he would turn around and blackmail them. I mean, this guy is dark.
Yeah, that's an allegation. I mean, he denied that, but that was alleged, and there was a story in The Guardian about that in like 2014. So this is someone who's been repeatedly accused of acting as an agent of the CIA. He's always denied it, but there's enough pieces here that it's really, it is worth, say, if you're Dianne Feinstein on the Senate Intelligence Committee, to ask some questions when you can actually get answers to them. I don't think you or I are ever going to solve this mystery because the CIA is so opaque by its very nature. But, those who are involved in oversight, those who have legal access to classified information so they can oversee the CIA, they really should be asking some questions right now because there is probable cause to believe.
So, Chip, you have spent your career looking into I'll call it the gray zone. And the gray zone is huge, and there are shades of gray within the gray zone. Sheldon Adelson is a prime example of these people who are not government people, not CIA people, not FBI counterintelligence people, not State Department people. They're private citizens, but they're rich and they're powerful, and they can be easily considered to be part of the global elite. So the interests of intelligence agencies and the power elite are often aligned. Who are some of the other players in that gray zone?
Yeah, I mean, I don't have specifics to that question off the top of my head. I mean, there are a lot of wealthy people who influence policy, and we do know that the intelligence community gets into bed with very unsavory people and very, unusual people. So they do use private citizens as assets. They clearly have a view of the world that unsurprisingly aligns with members of the ruling class. David Morales admired Blackwater, right? That's why he set up his company, UC Global, was because he wanted to be like Blackwater.
Right. Yeah, he was a Spanish Marine.
Yeah.
And how does that play out for the rest of us? So we're broadcasting here from Northern California, where we know in the past the FBI has targeted Earth First and falsely labeled them as eco-terrorists. When all we are really environmentalists. How does this state-sponsored surveillance, the surveillance state, played out for just the average citizen?
Well, the FBI is an incredibly pernicious organization. I mean, it is a political police force and political surveillance force since, if not its founding in 1908, then the founding of its radical division, an intelligence division, to go after radicals in 1920, 1919, whatever year it was, which was, by the way, headed by J. Edgar Hoover, right? J. Edgar Hoover's first role in what was then called the Bureau of Investigation was to head its first intelligence unit, which was originally called the Radical Division because it was engaged in surveillance of anarchists and socialists and people like that. And it engages in all of these pernicious abuses of power, which it has no legal authority to do. It initially tries to use immigration law, even though that's the responsibility at that point of the Secretary of Labor. Eventually, the Secretary of Labor rebels, and Hoover decides he must be a secret member of the IWW. They then justify a lot of their actions, this is in the 20s, on that they're gathering evidence that can be used to prosecute people under future legislation that has yet to be passed. That unit is disbanded in 1924 by Harlan Fiske Stone, and as one of the conditions of disbanding it, Hoover becomes director of the Bureau of Investigation. But in the 1930s, he brings it back in the run-up to World War II and gets Roosevelt to give him all of these extensive intelligence powers to target originally its Nazis and communists. But the FBI operated then, and I would say still operates, under what's called subversive infiltration theory, which is the idea that there are, the bad groups, the communists, and that they're infiltrating and influencing legitimate groups, and that therefore the FBI has a right to proactively surveil and in some cases disrupt those groups. And as the Church Committee pointed out, right, the people the FBI was claiming might be infiltrated or influenced by communists, they weren't helping them avoid infiltration. They were trying to destroy them. And coincidentally, it's people working against racism, it's people working against police brutality, people working against war and nuclear weapons, who are, of course, the people who are likely to be infiltrated by communists. In the 70s, it's clear the FBI has lost a lot of its credibility, and there's an attempt to sort of rebrand the counter-subversive project with the label of counterterrorism. Right-wing groups like the Heritage Foundation at this point are producing white papers for Congress since the 1970s that they need to undo any reforms because terrorists are coming. And the types of people they cite as terrorists are the Socialist Workers' Party and the left groups who are not engaged in violence. Interestingly enough, in the original Heritage Foundation white paper for Congress, the example of a state they cited that was besieged by terrorism was Rhodesia, the now defunct apartheid state. So that gives you another sort of look into their worldview. But, throughout the Reagan years, they used this sort of pursuit of terrorism to engage in this secretive foreign counterintelligence surveillance against the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador, against Palestinian groups. They still pursue the Communist Party and claim that they're influencing everyone in the world, labor unions, Jesse Jackson. And then after 9/11, the gloves really come off. And when you look at some of the surveillance of a group like, say, Occupy Wall Street, the FBI concedes it's a nonviolent group, but it might be taken advantage of by a terrorist in the future. To me, that's a complete repeat of the communist infiltration program, of subversive infiltration theory.
707-923-3911 is the number to call if you have a question for our guest, Chip Gibbons. He is the Policy Director for Defending Rights and Dissent. Can you say with certainty that our Congress and specific committees related to intelligence and foreign policy, et cetera, are aware of these discrete back alley funding of these organizations? Like,
do they care?
And what certainly they must know about it. And I only have about 8 minutes left. I also want to know if you yourself have been surveilled, Chip, because in a way you're sort of re-exposing the efforts of these whistleblowers.
Yeah, you sound like a terrorist to us.
Well, every year I file a FOIA request with the FBI asking for any files on me, and every year they come back saying they don't have any. You can decide if they're being truthful or not. Although one time, right after I had published an article about the Assange extradition hearing in the UK that got some public attention from a European parliamentarian, I was flying back from Montreal to Boston, and they put me on the secondary screening list. Only time I've ever flown and been on the secondary screening list, but I got my plane ticket and I saw the dreaded double S's, which I've written a lot about. I've written a lot about the terror watch list. And I'm like, oh, great. I've been placed on this list. Was it a complete coincidence? I did have a one-way ticket. It could have been that. But it felt very strangely timed to a piece I had just published about WikiLeaks. So I have no evidence I've been surveilled or harassed in any way, but who knows? As far as Congress, I mean, I don't know what they're aware of or not aware of. I mean, it is. I can't say definitively. It feels like the Intelligence Committee should be doing oversight of this, but it is remarkable sometimes how little some members of Congress know. I heard some sort of story from someone who met with their senator or representative, and they just knew nothing about Julian Assange or his case. Many of these people are completely unaware of what's going on. I'd like to think if you're on the Intelligence Committee, you should be. But are they aware and don't care, or unaware? I don't know. Are they unaware because they don't want to know? They're sort of burying their head in it. It's really hard to say with any certainty. But what I can say is that the oversight system that was put into place after the church committee is not working the way it's supposed to work. It is an enabling system, not an oversight system.
Yeah. Tell our listeners what, particularly those involved in various forms of activism, be it environmental activism or civil rights or now reproductive rights or immigration rights. Tell our listeners how they can find out if they're being surveilled, whether the CIA and the FBI have files on them. What countermeasures can we take on our own to protect ourselves?
I mean, the best thing you can do is file a Privacy Act request on yourself with the FBI and see what comes back. I mean, the FBI is not always forthcoming, obviously, when it responds to FOIA requests, and it can throw up a lot of difficulties, but you can get some degree of interesting information out of them. As far as what countermeasures you can take, I mean, that's a really tough question. A lot of people sort of advocate using encrypted devices like Signal and whatnot, and I think that's a good step. But it's worth pointing out that if the person you're talking to is an infiltrator, right, then you can encrypt your messages all you want. But if the person you're sending them to is a confidential informant, then it doesn't matter. I would say to avoid anybody who asks you to engage in violence or illegal acts. I mean, the FBI has a history of sending in informants who act as agent provocateurs. If somebody wants you to break the law in a violent way, that is not someone you need to be talking to in the first place, and there's a reasonable chance they're setting you up for prosecution. So I think just using a lot of common sense here is helpful if you are engaged in sort of above ground lawful political activity.
And what are our rights? Does anyone have the right to extract our SIM cards or take pictures of our IMEI codes or any of that? What requires a warrant and what doesn't?
That's a complex series of questions that I think would take more than 8 minutes. I mean, the courts have ruled that they need a warrant to access the content of your electronic devices. However, the government claims a border exception that allows them at the border to sort of access your electronic devices without a warrant. Ron Wyden and Rand Paul and Ted Lieu are putting forward legislation to try to stop that. They do every year. It doesn't go anywhere, but it should be passed. I mean, and then the other big thing is that if you're in a public place, you have a lot less rights because they say you have no expectation of privacy. So if you are at a public protest, there are limited rights for the courts
Right.
about being surveilled. They can take your photo. They can record what you're doing. There was a case in the 70s to try to challenge the military surveillance of Vietnam War protesters in D.C. It went all the way to the Supreme Court, and in a 5-4 decision, the Supreme Court just refused to hear the case, arguing that the plaintiffs had not shown any harm, that
Right.
the fact that their First Amendment activities were surveilled, they couldn't show how that harmed them. They said, well, we didn't want to protest anymore, and the court said, well, that's a self-subjected chill, right? That's not a
Chip?
government harm that you're doing. Yes.
I'm afraid we're out of time, but I do want folks to be able to listen and read about your efforts. How can they follow you?
And how can they support your work?
Please visit us online at Defending Rights and Dissent. It's rightsanddissent.org. Dissent like you are objecting to the government, not like you're going down a flight of stairs. I cannot tell you how many people make that mistake. We're one of the few NGOs left in Washington that are really challenging the FBI and the national security state.
Okay.
I strongly recommend supporting our work, and you can also find me on Twitter, unfortunately, at ChipGibbons89.
At ChipGibbons89. Thank you so much for returning to our show today.
And I want to emphasize that a constitutional attack against one is a constitutional attack against all.
Right.
Whether you're talking about Julian Assange or Donald Trump.
Right.
An attack against one is an attack against all. And thankfully, we have watchdogs like our guest, Chip Gibbons, keeping tabs on these abuses. Thank you, Chip.
Thank you so much, Chip, for being our guest this morning.
Thank you for having me back.
You bet. So we've been speaking with Chip Gibbons, who is the Policy Director for Defending Rights with an R and Dissent. And please go to his website and follow him to learn more about how this is unfolding. I want to mention, John, that our guest in October, our first guest, October 6th.
A great show.
We have Dr. Stephanie Woolhandler.
Woolhandler.
Yes, that's what I said.
Okay.
You just my mumbling. But tell our listeners what you're going to be talking about with her.
Yeah, so having been a patient as of yesterday in cardiac surgery, this is near and dear to me. So Steffi Woolhandler and her husband, David Himmelstein, have been on CNN and Market Watch and the Wall Street Journal and Nightline and all kinds of places talking about healthcare for all. And our show next Thursday,
a week from today,
we're going to be talking about medical debt. How medical debt in the United States, which affects 18% of all American households, means that there's a higher risk of bad medical outcomes
for the patient.
Right. So there's a correlation between owing money. So despite deductible private insurance or Medicare or Medi-Cal, if you owe money, your medical debt worsens the social determinants for health, causes more food insecurity, inability to pay for housing and utilities, eviction and foreclosure, and future medical care.
Right. So that's going to be next Thursday, John, from 9 to 10 a.m. with Dr. Stephanie Woolhandler. And we'd like to thank everyone who has tuned in today and
supported us during the pledge drive.
That's correct. So thank you so much, all the staff, volunteers, and everyone, Dorothy, for helping us out with today's show.